Evening, sir.
Howdy. Just in time.
Big drink.
That's right. It's a natural.
Got it.
Are we all set up? Should we?
Yep, we're live recording, and everyone who's going to be here is here.
All right, perfect. Okay, well, let's call to order the City of Tumwater Tree Board for Monday, August 12th, 2024. Let's do roll call. Let's start with Jim. Jim, why don't you go around and
And Owen?
Brent Chapman.
Mike Jackson.
Trey Grantham. We're missing Brody, right?
Yes, he is attending to a wildfire.
Oh. All right, so I suppose he's excused.
Yes.
All right, any changes to the agenda tonight?
There aren't any minutes, so my bad for having the approval of the minutes show up on there.
Oh, okay.
Still waiting for them.
Okay, no problem. Take that off. Okay, any tree board member reports? Brett? Guess we should probably say that, Anna, this is your last meeting, correct? We wish you luck. We're sad to see you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's exciting.
Oh, I don't know if this is an appropriate time to ask about our strategy for replacing Hannah.
We already have an applicant, Alex Chacon from Thurston Conservation District. He's one of their foresters. He has applied as a Tumwater resident, and we've received his application, and the mayor and the mayor's office is going on the next steps for interviews and whatnot.
Perfect. Okay. Coordinators report.
Yes. I have a certificate of appreciation for Hannah from the mayor and a letter from the mayor. Nice. Look here. Thank you, Hannah, for your dedication to the tree board. It's fun. It's printed on recycled paper. We made that change. And my only other update is that on Wednesday evening, doors will open at 6:30, but the event starts at 7. We'll have the Climate Change Element Open House at Osho Cultural Community Center, which is across the street from Walmart in Tumwater. It's from 7 to 9 for the programming, 6:30 if you want to come early and get some food and get settled. The intent of the workshop is essentially an open house to listen to residents, people who work in Tumwater, people who play and spend lots of time in Tumwater, to hear what they would like to see from our climate element, which has a resilience or adaptation sub-element and a greenhouse gas reduction sub-element. We'll have different stations that people go between to have these interactive conversations, guided questions. And if people cannot come on the 14th in the evening, we'll have an online open house that will have all the same information and all the same questions. And that will be open for about a month, a little bit longer than a month, for people to interact with at their leisure online, so that we can get as many people's perspectives in, so that we can take that feedback to then craft that draft element, and then we'll bring that back for public comment again. But just wanted to note that that workshop is happening on Wednesday, and you all are welcome to attend. I think I saw Brent, you signed up already. Thank you. That's my coordinator's comments today.
Don't there'll be specific topics on trees or urban forestry?
Urban forestry is interwoven to each of the 3 stations, I made sure. Yep.
Good job.
Is there, can you summarize, is there a baseline climate data for Tumwater?
Yes, and we'll be showing a lot of that data at the open house and on the online open house as well, in terms of the risk that we can expect in the next 50 years to 100 years, in terms of the different climate hazards, the trajectory of emissions, business as usual, or what we intend to, and what the state requires us to reduce our emissions to. And then there will be another station on implementation and governance, so that everyone can understand how we implement the different departments that are part of different decisions at the city, kind of just focused on, okay, we have these things that we want to put into a document that's normally pretty high level and kind of a little high level, a little bit more vague. How are we going to do the things on the ground, and what are the specific things that you want to see? We'll also be discussing environmental justice at each of the tables as well.
Do you know when the baseline was created or taken, or did that data was?
For greenhouse gases?
Are they, is the baseline based on various, data?
So we have historic data for the different climate hazards, like how much precipitation, how often do we have lots of rainfall in short periods of time, how many days of drought, what's our average days of extreme heat. So that data has been based on historic data, kind of averages over many decades. And then the greenhouse gas baseline for the city is our 2015 greenhouse gas inventory that was done by the Thurston Climate Action Team. However, the new state requirements do want us to have 2022 as the new baseline and have a new goal, so that's different. But that will be our new baseline moving forward per the state, but currently it's 2015.
Is there data on temperature extreme, both hot and cold?
We have definitely the hot data. And in terms of cold, I'm not sure if that's included on any of the posters that we'll be having physically at the event, but that data is available through the Climate Impacts Group, which is the University of Washington climate change data-focused organization that has produced county by county hazard data with different emission scenarios, with different sensitivities. It's a very helpful tool that all of the jurisdictions that have to do a climate change element are required to use as the, to take your word, as the baseline for getting that data for the future.
When I commonly look for climate information on temperature extremes, on, for example, on Weather Underground, I get CTAC.
We have,
You say it's county by county?
the projections are county by county. It's actually a smaller grid than within the county, and I can share that link with you.
And I'm wondering if there's any thought, I'm thinking of the Kingston, did I get it right, the development? What's the name?
Kingswood?
Kingswood development. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity here to say, well, this is the climate in this area at pre-development. This is the data post-development.
So capturing that data on a more Tumwater and different areas of Tumwater scale, there is data, historic data from the Port of Olympia, from the airport. However, that is a hotter part of the city than most of the rest of it. But we will be installing, once the grant agreement for our urban forester is approved by City Council, we're almost there. The first action that I need to take within, by the end of this year, is to actually install data loggers, ambient air temperature data loggers throughout the city in different areas. So we'll start to have more in-depth, more frequent observations and data collection for average ambient air temperature.
We've been talking about the magnitude of the Kingswood development, and this is kind of a precedent setting. And if we can document the impact on the climate from the development of this magnitude, it might tell us whether it's wise to do things like this in the future.
We will be installing the ambient air temperature sensors in areas of that disadvantaged community portion of Tumwater. We'll be choosing those areas based on what we have to affix it to, and how well this, we'll be figuring out where we need to put it. We'll have a control in those locations that'll be in that orange area of that map that we were looking at last month. That may or may not be close to this development, I'm not sure. But it's another part of that balancing things in Tumwater. We need housing, but housing often comes with some impervious surface. So in terms of the public comment tonight, we did get 2 public comments from Nancy Partlow. Previously, she had been emailing me and asking me to forward it to you all. I figured it would probably be more helpful if I put it more in the, I mean, it's already in public record if I'm emailing it to you, but more like in the agenda packet, so, I have that. And I also have a video that she sent with one of the comments that I'm going to share. That's all right, and then I realized that we have a person in the audience who might be here. So this is a video that came with the first public comment that she included, which is, these are the Castrol shakes.
Is there a date on that video?
It was beginning of August, end of July.
It was after our last tree board meeting and before this one.
Yep.
The date on the public comment on the first one, the date of the
It'd be
email,
great to have a date on that.
the first public comment, that video was attached, but it's not printable. So I figured I would.
Go to the website and see.
And we have Jerome from the Jolt News who is on. Would you like to make a public comment?
I have reaction to the public comment. Is that appropriate? Yeah, so for the purpose of discussion, I know Tanya has really brought this up before, but I'm really intrigued by this concept of infrastructure, or in this case, outstructure, to serve the objectives of keeping people safe and preserving the trees for more years. So I was just wondering if we might be interested in, as a board, in making a recommendation to City Council. I'm not quite sure what the logistics of the process are, but whether we want to start with a motion to jumpstart discussion or just have informal discussion about how this group might feel about, I don't know if you can bring up that photo, just so everybody knows what I'm talking about. The metal structure concept, and I know you presented this concept earlier.
Yeah, I did a wildlife bridge.
Yeah, kind of the same concept.
Yeah, I think it's really neat. I think it's a great idea.
I think there's a lot of research and a lot of study that needs to go into how to, if this can work to meet all the objectives, but, maybe you can just summarize for us the logistics for how our group can make recommendations to City Council for XYZ topic.
Question. I know that in the city code, you are here to advise City Council on matters of tree-related issues. That's the language in the code. Normally that's for when we're revising policy, but if you all would like to share a recommendation, especially if it's unanimous amongst the board, it'll be reflected in the minutes and I can share it with the city administrator. There's no required response from City Council, but I can make sure that they're aware of it because it is your role to advise City Council on tree-related issues.
I concur with what Nancy had put to, she had asked the city council to do an emergency stay and look at other alternatives to save the tree. And I think we should.
You clarify, it's my understanding that the mayor has contracted for another assessment. Has that been done?
So as of last week, when I got my most recent update about the Meeker Oak, we have finished the RFP process, the request for proposal, or I think it was a request for qualifications in this instance. We have a apparent winner of the solicitation, and we're now negotiating with them on the scope and the price for that second opinion.
There were gonna be three.
What?
three experts.
This is the
Different.
second opinion. It was intended to be a second opinion, not three.
Or one arborist.
One additional arborist outside of Kevin, that was coming from a pool of consulting arborists with track and all sorts of different qualifications. They provided their statement of qualifications. Actually, Trent's probably most, appropriate to ask.
There was like 6 submitted proposals. Some were pretty informal and some were very detailed. So most of them were from outside the area. There was one firm that did say they were not going to get involved in it. And I thanked the city council for asking, but they felt like it was too much of a hot button issue.
So where is that process?
So
What's next?
The city is
Yeah.
negotiating a contract with the apparent winner of that solicitation.
And will that settle?
Contracts take an unfortunate amount of time, but I think that they're trying to make it go as quickly as possible, but it'll take the amount of time it takes to get to that agreement and to get the approvals. And the very next city council meeting, if it is going to be on that, which I doubt it, is next Tuesday. And then every 2 weeks, we have another city council meeting, which is when that kind of contract may be approved. But I actually think that it's likely to be below that threshold, so it might not go to city council for approval. I wish I had a more updated, I know that we're working on the contract with a firm that was selected.
And even if it was awarded tomorrow, people have other work to do, it's already on the schedule, and so it may be weeks, months until,
It's a priority for the city to get this work done.
but the contractor may be busy with other work.
That could be a situation, yes. But hopefully for them applying or sending in their qualifications for this request for qualifications, they know that they've looked into the tree and they know that our intent is to figure this out as quickly as possible with a quality third-party perspective.
And did the city make any requirements that the work be accomplished by a certain time?
I was not party to the actual request for qualifications. It's likely on the city's website.
But they could put that in the contract.
Yeah.
That will definitely be in the contract, the number of working days.
So that assessment will be done, we don't know when, sometime in the future. And the result of that assessment, we don't know. Could be, yeah, the tree is perfectly safe, let's do everything we can to keep the street safe. Or the assessment could be, it's dangerous and needs to be removed as soon as possible.
They'll be doing the same kind of assessment that Kevin did. There was one one firm who suggested above and beyond those same things that Kevin had done. Resistance drilling was mentioned by one of the firms. I don't know if that's the one that was selected. I wasn't on the committee for that. But they'll be using the same methods to find their own qualified findings.
Thank you. In regards to the, what are we calling this? Barrier, artwork, bridge. Safety structure. Safety structure. I assume that DOT would have to approve anything being built over a state highway. And that's a process, right? Which may take years. Yeah.
Depending on how they decide could be a design build but, I don't know what they have planned for the future, so it would have to fall within that too.
So it's not, Tumwater doesn't have the freedom to say, yeah, build a barrier over this road.
Probably not, because there's probably right of way that's called. They wouldn't be able to build it over the freeway or highway, but
Yeah, state highway. But the port's not involved. like, because it's not really port property.
I don't think so. I think that's all that WASDA and Tumwater right away.
No, the trees on city right of way.
Yeah.
So just like down Capitol Way, there's a sign saying, beware, there's a 14-foot bridge, train ahead. If you're over 14 feet, turn off. You know, those sorts of things. I mean, this thing would have to meet height regulations for
Minimum height, yeah.
getting vehicles under and all that sort of DOT, as well as width.
Right, it would probably be fire truck or,
Mhm.
Yeah, but hopefully giraffes are not going to be transported down.
Are the signs that got put up, not this weekend, but last weekend, was that like for litigation or to?
I only learned about the signs today.
What are the signs? I don't know, but
The, limbs may fall,
Slow down.
like
30
danger.
miles per hour.
speed limit signs.
Well, it's 45 for on the
Yeah,
highway,
yeah.
but then it says slow down to 30 miles per hour, limbs may fall.
That's the opposite of what I do. I go fast.
What I thought. I thought it was-
Reduce
I
the.
thought that part was.
Not that
We'll
loud.
put those up.
It's-
I imagine it's the city since it's on our right of way, but I don't.
Yeah, they went up on Saturday. I thought I took. They're both ways. They're coming and going, which was interesting. I went to Spud and this young man helped me. Tried to live with that church since I was 16. The branches aren't even over the road.
Found out, is this group doesn't have an appetite for making a recommendation to city council for something to explore
I do.
something like this, regardless of as a kind of copy Nancy's verbiage, regardless of the outcome of the assessment, if it's deemed safe, you know, just to totally cover, not totally, but more cover our the city's liability going forward. And there's a lot of variables, I mean, so it'd be another assessment, another exploration process, right away, DOT requirements.
Well, I'm trying to imagine, I don't believe I've ever seen a structure built around a tree to catch limbs.
There's a wildlife bridge over I-90.
Yeah,
It's
wildlife
probably-
bridge,
yeah, it's
sure,
probably
and there
built
are
around it, but-
structural supports at Capitol, on the
Yeah.
Capitol campus to hold
Yeah.
branches up. But this is more like a barrier, net.
Have you heard Hannah's question?
For like green roofs, they just, when you plant them and stuff, because there's a green roof on the DOC building. That's what, when I looked at the ones online, that's what they look like.
So my leaning would be to encourage city council to explore the parameters and the possibility of installing such a structure regardless of the outcome of the assessment.
I would probably say we should wait until, I mean, no sense in spending money to is.
And I'm thinking that the tribe might either say they pay for it, or would say, no, we don't want, I mean, if it's designed, it has to meet our cultural standards. Oh, we don't want to delay the report.
Oh, no, yeah, this would be completely outside the tree assessment.
What you're trying to saying is, if the report says that the tree is viable and stay, then this should be considered.
Or at least part of because part of the, you know, what the arborist will do too is like their cabling or something. And branches from. So that could be incorporated into whatever that I'm doing as well. I don't know, it just, I can just see like, you have to get a structural engineer, you're gonna have to right away. Like that could get very expensive.
And we don't want that to delay the decision-making process on the.
No, well, and you don't wanna spend a bunch of money if.
So after the decision is made.
I think after the decision.
We would
would be.
Revisit it.
encourage.
Well, not after the decision's made, after the tree assessment report is available.
That's what I.
That's very interesting.
Travis?
People think a little creatively. Yeah.
Case study for the current protection of trees and vegetation code implementation.
Awesome. Pass it over to Alex here. You can have the magical mouse.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all. Thanks for inviting me here to talk about development code and tree regulations in the city of Tumwater. Just going to do a quick run through of what I'm hoping to cover in the discussion today. I'm going to stop periodically throughout just to see if there are any questions and try and gauge if I'm going too fast or if I need to step back and to talk about different items in a different way just to make sure that it's all understood. But first, I'm going to be talking about the tree removal waiver and land clearing exemption permits. Those are our most common tree removal permits within the city of Tumwater. Then we're going to talk about development regulation framework, so how a development goes through the process of evaluating trees and determining, how their development is going to impact the, ground and surroundings that they're going to be building on, and what the regulations say in our code as far as, the allowances and, how many trees can be removed per acre, all of that information. I'll talk about the standards, the tree reports, all of those things that come along with development applications as a part of that. Then we'll go through the case study review, which you all have seen the tree reports or arborist reports for Belmont Flats, Yorkshire, and Kingswood apartment developments. And then you all did a great job asking me a whole bunch of questions. So I've got a bunch of those questions answered at the end, and we'll definitely cover others throughout. So very happy to be here and talk with you all about the trees. Just to introduce myself, as I mentioned before, my name's Alex. I have been working at the city for 3 years. Previously worked at James City County for 5 years as a planner. And I have a master's in public administration and policy from Virginia Tech. Go Hokies. Over the past 3 years of being here with the city, I was able to obtain my certification as an American Institute of Certified Planner, which you have to take a test and other stuff for, but I won't bore you with all of that. But my direct supervisor is Tammy Merriman, and she's the permit manager. She also reviews development applications and, all the other tree permits. So just wanted to, the two of us are pretty much the people reviewing all the development applications and looking at it from a planning perspective, and reviewing the tree protection ordinance code to implement the code requirements. So come up to the counter, you'll see one of us. So first I'm going to talk about tree removal waivers and land clearing exemptions, like I mentioned. These are the ones that you would typically see homeowners getting around the city for all sorts of different reasons. So I'll start with tree removal waivers, which are the most common. The tree removal waiver criteria is housed under 1608-080, which is where our exemptions are for tree code. And it says specifically that the removal of not more than 6 trees from any parcel of land in 3 consecutive calendar years. So it is an allowance to remove 6 trees within a 3-year time frame. And we take in applications, we ask for photos of those trees as a part of the applications to make sure we're documenting which trees are being removed on those properties, and it allows us to make sure that those parcels and property owners are not exceeding that 6 trees within the 3-year period. Okay.
We may get interrupted a lot, but can you just help me, because I'm a steep learning curve here. Parcel.
Mhm.
Parcel can be the size of this room, or it can be 20 acres.
Yes, yeah, it can be even larger than that, correct.
So a family with a small forest, small timber, 20, 48, 160 acres, if they remove 7 trees in 3 years, that's again, they have to get permission to do that.
It goes into a different category of permit, that's correct.
As opposed to a 1/4 acre homeowner who removes 7 trees.
Both of those would actually go into the same permit. Anything above 6 has to go into a different permit category.
How big's the tree?
So it's any tree, on their property so what is considered a tree? Yeah, anything 6 inches in diameter, and then at breast height. Yeah, no problem. So people do not have to have a reason for why they want to remove those trees. They are, by ordinance, allowed to do that, as long as they get a permit through us and don't exceed the 6 trees within the 3-year period.
So, I add a patio, I take out 3 trees, add a patio, I don't need a permit. I sell my house. The next year, new person wants to add a garage, wants to take out 4 trees to put in his garage. Same parcel of land, 2 different property owners. Does the second owner who wants to take down 4 trees, which that owner probably thinks, oh, this is within code, I'm not taking out 6 trees, may not know that the previous owner took out 2 trees a year or 2 before. How do we deal with that?
So thankfully, our permit system has an ability to track the parcel. So we look at all the permits that have been applied for a parcel, and as a part of my review of the application, I look at the past 3 years and see, have other trees been removed from this parcel? If they have, and they're requesting to exceed that amount of trees, then I say, if you want to actually remove more than the 6 trees within the 3 years, we have to go into this other category of permit. If you reduce your amount of trees down to be compliant with 6, so 2 the previous year, different owner, now we're going to limit that to 4 instead of the 5 that they were originally planning on, then we could move forward with that tree removal waiver, and that would be their 6 trees within the 3-year period. And, in 2 years, they would be allowed to remove 2 more trees. And then, the 3rd year, the 4 additional trees come back. So it's a rotating cycle based on when those trees were removed.
And what motivates the first property owner to get a permit?
We have lots of active residents that, contact us. Yeah, so. Yeah, I mean, anyone, that sees. Yeah, they should have gotten a permit, yeah. So any tree that's removed within the city, should have a permit, at a baseline, a tree removal waiver, but there are other permits that we'll get into. Yeah, no problem. So, that's the first category. The second category are land clearing exemptions. So that's the, clearing of dead, diseased, or hazardous trees after verification. This says by the city tree protection professional, but in reality, it's any arborist or forester that is certified, or has a certification, would be able to provide a report saying and determining whether it's a dead, diseased, or hazardous tree. And for every tree cleared under this exemption, at least one replacement tree shall be planted. So examples of instances where this would take place would be a street tree that is damaging the sidewalk, for example, causing a hazard, potential tripping hazard, damage to infrastructure, anything like that would typically be considered under that hazardous category. Dead or diseased, an arborist or forester would make that determination and, be able to provide us with the documentation in that report to say how they've made that determination. And then it would be removal of that tree. So if it's on the property and it was a required tree that, was required by, for example, a plat. So some plats have a requirement that 2 trees are planted on a individual parcel as a part of the development of the home. And those are usually written on the plat and documented as a part of the overall landscape plan. So we would need to do a research looking back at the landscape plan and say, was this tree required to be there? If the answer is yes, then they have to get this land clearing exemption, and then they would remove and replace the tree as a part of that permit process.
Everybody can you define the parcel and plat? You just.
Yes, sorry, yep. So parcel is a legal, number that's provided by the Thurston County Assessor's Office, and it has a legal description that defines the actual bounds, metes and bounds of your property. And then a plat is like a subdivision. So any, multi-lot division of land that would have those, typical infrastructure improvements like, public streets, sidewalk, planter strip, water, sewer, all of that. And then for street trees, in this example, we do have a detail with our transportation and engineering department that talks about the requirements for planting within the city's right-of-way. And the right-of-way sometimes extends past where you necessarily think it does. It's not just the pavement area of the road. It usually extends all the way through to the sidewalk at a minimum, sometimes even a foot or two past the sidewalk to incorporate, required improvements and making sure that there's adequate space for, city work to be done. So the detail in this circumstance typically requires root barriers on both sides of the tree to make sure that, the infrastructure is protected, and ideally the tree roots are growing down as a part of that. We all know that those aren't perfect standards, but they are the standards that we have as part of our infrastructure development, where we have, 6 foot planter beds.
Barriers as in landscape fabric?
Yes, typically it's landscape fabric, or there are specific brand names that I don't know off the top of my head, but yes.
Plastic, anywhere from 18, I don't know, off the top of my head, feet on either side of the tree.
Yeah, and there are different requirements for how deep the landscape or the root barrier has to go, depending on the size of the landscape area or the landscape strip. So it can get less deep depending on
Wider.
if it's wider, exactly.
Actually learned in the Tumwater Tree Board that was bad for the trees in the ground. I didn't know that. We had discussed that before.
And this is going vertically, not horizontally.
Oh.
Yeah, so
Right along the edge of the sidewalk.
To impede water or air infiltration.
yeah, so the idea is to keep the roots from going horizontally towards the street and the sidewalks, and ideally trying to advocate for them to go down. They don't have like little speakers or anything to say, please shoot your roots down, but just the barrier itself does, can help. and this is where the right tree also has to be chosen as a part of the street trees, and where we're leaning on the urban forest management plan and, better tree choices within the neighborhoods. A lot of the issues that we see are, county plats or just older subdivisions where either root barriers weren't required or, just we know more about the trees now than we did back then, so. All right. Okay, so there are other types of land clearing exemptions as well, and this is the rest of the list from 1608-080. I don't think I have to jump into every single one of these, but just a few would include land clearing in emergency situations. So, for example, if a tree after a storm is partially knocked over, you do not need a permit from the city for that to remove that tree. But you do need to come into us after you remove that tree to document that it was removed and to do a replacement tree. So we prioritize the safety of, people and property, and then come in to us afterwards and make sure that we get, the replacement tree planted and, make sure everything is safe after the fact. We work with our operations and public works department as far as, any land clearing that's required as a part of a public project for within the public right-of-way. So we've got a couple of projects going on around town for sidewalk expansions, and those still have to meet the requirement of one-to-one tree replacement in places where they have to remove trees to expand either the roadway or to build in the sidewalks that aren't existing currently. That's just another example where, we are still going through this permit process and documenting everything and doing the replacement trees in those situations.
Can you refresh my memory, what's the smallest tree that counts for replacement of caliper?
So what size tree can be replanted? Yeah, it's 2-inch caliper, 6 inches above the root ball.
But evergreen.
Yeah, or 6-foot evergreen, exactly.
You got this memorized, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So those are some other ones that we just see pretty typically. Okay, so there are a couple instances in recent past where we have given discretion to certain situations. So, for example, there's the Deschutes Heights subdivision where we work with, where we were working with the HOA and received an arborist report for the entire subdivision as a part of an assessment of hazards that were caused by street trees into the sidewalk. And there were just all sorts of situations throughout the entire subdivision where we have allowed the property owners who are responsible for replacing these trees to use the overarching report as opposed to needing to get individual reports for every single tree. So we typically require a photo of those instances just to make sure that there is actually a problem there. And then we do the same process through the land clearing exemption where we require the replacement tree and we go out and make sure and inspect it, make sure the root barrier is there. The second situation that's come up more recently, we had there's a subdivision, Simmons Heights, near R.W. Johnson, that was experiencing some really bad water line issues that were being compromised by roots. And they were planted, these front yards are typically like 10 by 10 or 10 by 12 and pretty small overall. And there was a required landscape tree in the front yard of each of these homes shown on the landscape plan. The subdivision overall has more than their needed amount of trees that was planted as a part of both the landscape plan and retained trees around a wetland for that development. So we made the determination that in this circumstance, they had an overwhelming amount of trees, more than the baseline requirement, and we weren't going to require the replacement trees in the fronts of these homes because we didn't want further water issues to take place and potentially cause more damage potentially in the future. So these are just a couple of examples that, you know, we just want to make sure that it has a common sense to it as well. We're not just applying it where it needs to happen in every single instance, but we do work with community members where there are broad issues, and we can tackle those with those HOAs and with those community members.
Simmons Heights, that's very recent, right?
Yes, it is.
So they did make a decision on that.
Yes.
Good. The first decision wasn't very good. Because that's what you say, you know, when it's 10 by 10,
Mhm.
planted the wrong damn trees anyway, and then they had the bankruptcy up there. And so, they just, you know, those 4 landowners, they just want to get rid of those 4 trees and not plant anything back. Because from the very beginning of the tree board, you know, we've always said that the best way to have enough trees is to have a wetland and a wetland buffer. And on Simmons Heights, they've got that really nice buffer down at the other end.
Yeah.
And, that's good to know, because they never got back to me that you did allow that to happen.
Yeah,
Is that your decision?
mine and my supervisor, Tanny.
Good.
Yeah. So we also saw that the boulevard down the middle did provide some good shading out front, you know, where it doesn't provide it for obviously all the fronts of those homes, but we just felt like this was a little bit duplicative and maybe heavy-handed from the original approver of that landscape plan, and that this made sense here, that, you know, we didn't need to have those trees in the front yards.
Good.
I know that there was something that we were discussing with the potential changes to this code in the future was for the tree credit system and the wetland buffer not counting towards the total credits. So that would be a interesting thing to traverse if that change should become permanent.
Yeah. And the group will have a chance to look at that
Oh, yes.
policy and those code changes once we start that process back up.
Is there any thought that a 10 by 10 yard is non-sustainable?
No, I think it's more about where we intentionally put the trees that need to be replanted, or, you know, making sure that we've got the proper, you know, trees located in these, you know, specific instances. You know, I wasn't the reviewer for this plat at that time, but I will say they had a lot more landscape trees along R.W. Johnson, and, you know, a lot of requirements around their stormwater pond, I believe, as well, for planting. So I think there were plenty of plantings in this development already that maybe it shouldn't have been required from the beginning necessarily. So this covers the tree removal waivers and land clearing exemptions. I just wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions at this point before moving on to the development regulations.
My understanding, Tim, is gonna be covered later, that there's some waiver on land clearing that says if you can't put enough trees in this, you can pay the city into a fund, and then trees are planted elsewhere.
Mhm.
Is that's not part of this?
That's not part of the tree removal and land clearing exemption, that's correct. That's, more comes into play, and I think has only happened once since I've been here, if I'm remembering correctly, with one specific development, but that's more, as it relates to specific development applications.
And you have a feel, I mean, you've been here 3 years, you said. So what I hear you saying is that waivers are rare.
Tree removal waivers and land clearing exemptions, come in a few a week sometimes, and sometimes they're, you know, none at all for weeks at a time. I think it's on a later slide, in the questions, but it talks about, I think I brought up how many land clearing exemptions we've done over the past 3 or 4 years. So I'll have more exact numbers during the question period. But tree removal waivers, we do get a fair amount of, during the course of the year.
Previously, we've talked about maybe an annual summary from you, soon, that would say, this is how many tree waivers we had this year. Not so that we can pick at them, but so that we can see any trends.
Mhm.
They're significantly more than 10 years ago or less. So that's something I think that would be beneficial for the tree board to know.
Although knowing the tree removal waiver, they say you had 20 tree removal. I don't know if it was, is that documented or?
We do document that. It's within the, I believe it's within the description of each of the land clearing exemptions and the tree removal waivers within our permit system. We track the number for each one, so.
You can say the number of waivers and the number of trees.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll note that I had the personal experience a few months ago of going through the tree removal waiver process on behalf of my neighbor, who had a tree that was diseased and causing issues. Now fine, but we went through the process, and I went through the process with Alex, which was enlightening for me. It's free, by the way, and very quick. We didn't remove the tree at all, but there is a tree removal waiver in our permit system now that says that we removed the tree, but we did not remove the tree. So some people might not follow through with the tree removal after getting the waiver if they're doing their due diligence to make sure that they're following the rules, and then people change minds. So there's at least one tree removal waiver in our system that did not result in a removed tree.
This data may not necessarily be accurate.
It doesn't always mean that the tree was removed. It means that someone asked permission to remove the tree.
Yeah, and there are a couple of things there. So that is part of the reason we request photos of the trees, so we can come back later if someone says, I didn't actually remove that tree, and want to remove it now. I don't want it to count against the 6 overall, or count them twice. So then we actually have documentation to say that is the tree, it does match the picture. So that's one component. The next is that typically the tree removal waiver, you've got 6 months to remove that tree. And then similarly for the land clearing exemption, 6 months. There is the ability to extend the land clearing exemption. And the only fee that you may have to pay for a land clearing exemption is a right-of-way permit if you're actually working within the city's right-of-way. Because there are certain implications in needing to have bonded and licensed contractors working within the city right-of-way, as there's infrastructure that costs way more, a lot more money than an individual would want to be responsible for necessarily.
And the waiver process, like Alyssa was saying, developer may get a permit to clear land, assuming that they're going to plant trees later, but that removal of the trees may occur this year, and the planting of the trees may happen years later.
Yeah, for a development, typically the process that would remove those trees follows pretty quickly with development occurring on the property, because the permits only have so long to be active. So as long as they're making continual progress towards the development occurring and putting in infrastructure in, getting inspections, it can extend that permit life. But it typically is within, you always see active, the site being actively developed in most, I'd say 90% of instances, when development starts to happen on a property. So you wouldn't typically see it lay dormant for long, extended periods of time, without.
Yeah, I walk through Skyview twice a week. Land was cleared 3 years ago. Some trees were put in. Well, the developer told me he plans to build 8 houses a year. That means 15 years before that's all 120 houses.
But more of that have been built, I think, already, haven't they?
There's been about 40 houses built,
Right.
another 80.
Mhm.
But I'm just saying, it's quite a process. It can be a lengthy process. I mean, not if it's a single lot and you're cutting down the trees for a year. But in a larger unit, it can be some time before.
Yeah, especially with phase subdivision. So there are some subdivisions over 100 houses that are able to be constructed in phases. And in this circumstance with Skyview, they had, maybe it was 80 in the first phase and 40 in the second phase or something like that, where, the infrastructure and everything was constructed for that first phase first, and they did the land clearing and everything for that. They had to do additional land clearing to get the storm pond in and, get the infrastructure in for all of that. But then you're absolutely right. That second phase is just starting on the infrastructure being put in now. So you're seeing the, roads and everything, go in, and they'll record the final plat at that point, have the lots for, to construct on at that point. So that's very true. Any other questions on this process? Okay, so we'll go through and start going through the development regulations. These are typically for anything that's called a project permit. So that includes subdivisions, shoreline substantial development permits, new commercial or industrial developments, and multifamily developments. Those are the typical ones you see, come into play for this type of permit, which is typically called a site development grading permit. It usually includes a component of it that is land clearing related. So a land clearing permit or a site development grading permit can be used synonymously with each other. Site development grading permit typically includes other infrastructure improvements as well as a part of that. So the land clearing is just a component of that overall site development grading. So typically as a part of a development application, so this is even before we get to, an approved project, we're looking at the requirements in our ordinance as far as what is needed with a permit application to review a development overall. And I'm using development in a very broad sense. So that could be a subdivision or an apartment complex or an industrial building or a commercial building. Any of those would be considered a development. And as a part of that development review, we have what's called the Development Review Committee. So it involves the building official, the planning department, and member of the engineering and transportation staff. And we review all of the relevant codes for the city, whether it's the development guide or the ordinance, and provide developers with comments, red lines at these meetings to identify where there are deficiencies in their plan compared with what the ordinance requires. So typically early on in the process, we're reminding the developers that a forester's report is required as a part of a development. And a forester or an arborist report would typically be comprised by 3 different sections. So that's the tree inventory, the tree protection plan, and the tree replacement plan. So I'll get into specifics about these other components in a second, but I just wanted to kind of outline those right here. Tree inventory would include kind of a documentation of the different trees on the property. Sometimes they do it based on grove if it's a large parcel. Other times, if it's a smaller parcel, they're able to do it by individual tree. So that's both are allowed processes. They just have different components to them that are required as a part of that forester's report. The tree protection plan will show the intended areas of trees that would be protected as a part of the development. So Typically, that means that you're going to be putting up silt fence and markings to identify which trees are going to be, which area of trees or which individual trees are going to be protected during the development process. And that needs to be in the ground prior to the majority of the infrastructure going in. So you would typically mark where those areas are as a part of the initial staking of the project. So land clearing doesn't take away any of the components of, the critical root zones or areas where the trees that are going to be retained are identified on site. And then they do all of that tree protection fencing to make sure early on in the process as they can to protect those areas. And then we have a replacement plan that's typically a part of that site development grading permit and is included as a part of the landscaping plan. I believe that was included for the Kingswood Apartments project within your packet. And that shows how many trees were required to be replaced or retained as a part of the project and what their required replacement amount was. And so typically all of that is shown within that landscape plan, to be able to identify which trees are being replaced or are being planted on the development.
If I can just back up and see if I understand that. Again, my learning curve is real steep here. Tumwater doesn't have any power over who sells what when. So resident X has got a piece of land, and they've had it in their family 100 years or 2 years. And for whatever reason, they say, I'm going to sell this 1 acre lot, or I'm going to sell this 20 acre field and pasture land or whatever. And they say, yeah, time for me to retire or whatever, I'm selling my land. The city has no influence on that. So the property owner, the city has made a map of zoning saying this part of the city, in the future, should look like this. So even though it's been a family farm for 100 years, that area now has been being developed and incorporated in the city, and that has been zoned for multifamily dwellings. And that decision was made years ago.
Yeah.
So now the property owner says, okay, I want to sell my pasture. I can sell it to somebody and they can keep it as a pasture, or I can sell it to a developer who can put it into whatever the city has zoned it to be.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep.
And you don't have any influence as to when that happens or how much of it happens at one time.
Yeah, those are all.
Somebody can say, 100 property owners can say, we're going to sell this year, or none. And the city has no control over that.
Correct. These are all market-driven decisions by companies and individuals that are outside of the city's purview. We do create a certain level of the overall, economic basis by, just our larger planning efforts and making sure that we've got cohesive planning policies. So our comprehensive plan is ongoing right now, as Alyssa mentioned at the beginning, and we're updating that for what state has kind of passed down as certain requirements we have to implement. And there are, people within the community that want to change their land use designation as well. Maybe they want, instead of, multifamily, they want to go to something more industrial or something like that. It has to make sense for the city to approve that, and that's a decision by city council. But right now, we do have that map that shows the different types of zoning districts within the city. And when you dive into the ordinance, it talks about the different uses that are allowed within those zoning districts. If it's not listed within that list of approved uses or accessory uses or conditional uses, then it would not be allowed within that zoning district.
property owner can sell it to someone who wants to keep it the same use,
They could.
even though it's zoned for something else.
That's correct. The Growth Management Act talks about the, highest and best uses being put forth towards properties, within city limits. So there is a principle within planning to, try and, utilize the infrastructure and the, and that includes the roads, that includes the, you know, all of the resources that we have in a city, to the furthest extent that we can. So that means trying to develop as, you know, dense as we can within the city limits, but keep our counties as rural areas that aren't being developed in these mechanisms or these ways. So that's why we try and put, you know, our apartment buildings and et cetera close to, you know, the cities where we've got those infrastructure and those improvements. Yeah.
Thank you.
This just goes over, I guess, a broader list of what we are looking at during that development stage, reviewing applications, and making sure that we've got, you know, these items included within those Forrester reports. So, as we talked about earlier, you know, these are some of the standards for size, type, and tree, you know, conditions of trees, what we're considering trees within the city of Tumwater, and how many they count towards our tree count. So a tree is defined as a healthy, living woody plant characterized by one or more main stems or trunks and many branches, and having a diameter of 6 inches or more, measured 4.5 feet above ground level. For the purposes of calculating tree retention standards, trees 24 inches or greater in diameter are counted as 2 trees. So when we have larger trees, we are trying to identify, you know, those trees and make sure that we are getting, you know, more trees back if they do intend to remove those trees. And then species such as willow, cottonwood, poplar, and other species are likely to obstruct or injure site improvements, aren't considered trees as a part of that tree report. So they, doing their tree inventory of the trees on the site, will identify, you know, what trees are, what species of trees they are, and if they are those types of species that are, you know, considered, you know, under that category, they would not count as a tree in that tree count.
Would the arborist or forester know that, like, Liriodendron, which is commonly called a poplar, really shouldn't fit in this category?
Yes, yeah, they should
That's
be.
common names, poplars that aren't named
Mhm.
in this regard.
Okay, yeah, and they should be, they're all certified arborists, the ones that we receive reports from, so.
Just because there's poplar in the common name, they can make a different conclusion.
We typically take the report as face value, so we are relying on these experts to know what invasive species are, what, you know, non-native tree species are, and identify those in those reports.
Thought those trees were okay in a buffer, in a wetland buffer.
Yeah, they're okay in a wetland, I think.
So they
Well,
don't.
we've always counted them.
Yeah, so they don't count as trees as a part of a development plan to, like, keep, as part of the tree retention requirements. They can count if you want to keep them, like in a wetland buffer, if you are not intending to develop or have infrastructure, you know, close to that wetland buffer, then there's no I mean, you actually aren't allowed to disturb the wetland buffer, so you wouldn't be able to take those out. They would have to remain in place.
And they would count.
Right.
They would not count as a tree as a part of the development application, no.
Someplace else in the code that's mentioned, besides there. Because we've always counted those in the last 20 years, 25 years.
Only if they're in the buffer, wetland buffer.
Yeah, in the wetland buffer, same way with ash. I mean, ash is just as bad as cottonwood. But it's wonderful in a wetland and the wetland buffer.
I think that our idea is that you can't remove those trees anyway, so there, would not be a need to count those within the wetland buffer as a part of the overall tree count for the development.
It's not part of the buildable land, it's
Interesting.
not part of the,
That's
Accurate.
And they're getting credit for them.
Huh?
They're getting credit for them on terms of.
No, you're saying you can't.
Yeah, my understanding is that they would remove those trees regardless of whether they're in the buffer or not.
No, we can't remove them, but I mean,
Remove them from the count of the trees on the property.
they
And I-
have to be removed, you're saying?
From the count.
so there's
From
the
the-
count, and then there's the physical removal. Physical removal cannot be done, but the removal of it from the theoretical count of trees on the property, it's not included because you can't remove them even if you wanted to from the wetland buffer, so they're not part of the count.
Well,
So that means,
there's someplace else, and that's R1 though.
that apply to like our Gary Oak, regardless of where it is, that doesn't count in the inventory either because it's protected?
So that tree is not a part of a development plan, so it wouldn't fall within this category of, what we're talking about here.
Are you asking about Gary Oaks in general?
Are they counted in the inventory?
I mean, if
Yeah.
a Gary Oak was on a individual parcel that was being developed, yes, it would count as a tree.
But it's protected, just like these wetland trees are protected, so that doesn't seem congruent to me. Like some
Well,
protected
the
trees
thing
we're
is, what I'm
counting in
saying
the
is
They are
inventory.
if it's associated with development,
We've counted those trees the last 25
if it's
years
associated with development.
Oh,
in the count.
okay. I can follow up with, some other people who've been here a little bit longer and see if there's a different process, but this is how I think we've been implementing it at least over the last 3 years.
You do these all the time.
Well, I know, that's
These
what
are
I'm
these
saying.
assessments.
I mean, we've got several in there now that we've done that, exact same way. Because we've always said that the only way that development really works with our code is if you've got a wetland that's forested,
And you're forced to save,
that you're forced to save it,
otherwise you never get enough trees saved,
you'd never get enough trees
especially
saved.
within the 5%
You never
set
would.
aside.
Right. And you never do.
Yeah.
That's why we tried to change that, 4 or 5 years ago, and didn't have any success.
All right, I can look into that a little bit further, but I appreciate the
We need to
knowledge there.
definitely.
Yeah.
I'm
Look
curious
into
about the
that.
word protected regardless of whether it's in a wetland or not.
Sorry, what was that?
Well, back to the Gary Oak, that's
Oh,
a
okay.
protected species, it doesn't matter what, if it's in a wetland or not.
Protected habitat, technically. It's a protected habitat, technically.
Well, it's more.
It is a tree species, but it's protected as a habitat and not as a species by the state.
It's more protected in the county than the city. Right now.
I think, yeah, maybe if you could clarify that as well, the
Okay.
the Gary Oak protection is,
Yeah, I don't think there's any Gary Oak.
We refer to the Fish and Wildlife,
Yeah,
recommendations for priority habitats and species because it's a
definitely protected.
protected habitat.
Are snags counted anywhere?
I believe dead trees are not counted as a part of the tree. It has to be a living tree, and it's got to be, actually, brings me to one of my next points, I believe. It must meet the following standards in order to be counted, for the purposes of meeting tree retention standards. So, must have a post-development life expectancy of greater than 10 years, must have a relatively sound and solid trunk, must have no major, insect or pathology problems, no significant crown damage, should be fully branched and generally proportional in height and breadth for the tree age, and must be wind firm in post-development state.
So habitat snags,
Don't count as
you
trees.
would want removed.
They wouldn't count as trees. It depends on where on the development they were located as to whether a developer would want to remove them or not. So if there were snags in a wetland, for example, they would leave those as habitat, but probably not in the middle of a development necessarily. Right. Now we're going to get into some of the tree standards and required retention of trees. So in the ordinance, it says either 12 trees per acre or 20% of trees on a property shall be retained. If the greater of the two numbers above is not able to be retained, it may be waived if 3 or more of the following reasons are met. So I'll pause there real quick just to say that whichever of the two are higher would need to be retained. So either 12 trees per acre or 20% of the trees, whichever of those amounts are the greater amount of trees on the property. However, if a development is not able to achieve either 12 trees per acre or 20%, they would need to state which of these items are being met based on the request for a waiver. So we typically talk about this during our development review process. We need to start asking for it to be more clarified within our forestry reports and arborist reports, so it's easier to identify which of these are actually being applied to that application. But the most common ones that we see are B, C, and D. The tree retention standard can't be achieved because of the necessity of compliance with applicable zoning and development requirements, including but not limited to residential densities, open space requirements for active recreation, floor area ratios, parking requirements, stormwater requirements, et cetera. And then C, tree retention standard cannot be achieved because of the tree or trees do not have a reasonable chance of survival once the site is developed or modified and may pose a threat to life or property if retained. And then D, the applicant has made reasonable efforts to reconfigure or reduce building footprint, site access, on-site utility systems, and parking areas to avoid impacts to trees on the property. So usually those are the 3 that are applied to development applications that need to clear more than the 12 trees per acre or 20% of the trees. In those circumstances where they fall below the 12 trees per acre or 20% of the trees, they have to create a tree tract that's 5% of the developable acreage of the tree, or of the property, and they need to replant their deficiency at a 3-to-1 ratio. So if they are required to retain 100 trees on the property and can only meet the requirement at 40 trees, then there's a 60-tree gap that they have to replace at a 3-to-1 ratio. So that's 180 trees that they are now replanting on the property as a part of their development application. The priority of the replanting is within the tree tract. However, it's only to the amount practical within that tree tract area, not all of those trees don't automatically have to be replanted in that tree tract. We have other development requirements. I'll go back to that in a second. We have other development requirements that require trees to be planted on property. We have landscape codes. We have buffers that are required between zoning districts. We've got right-of-way or parking screening that's required. And then we have interior buffers as well, so landscape islands between rows of parking areas. So trees are by default required to be planted all throughout a development, and the priority is for those trees to be planted within the tree tract. However, if there are additional trees that need to be planted, they get spread out through other different mechanisms within the landscape, within these sections of code. So a lot of times you're actually planting over the amount you're required to replant just based on the landscape regulations or the parking lot regulations in some of these larger developments, which I think we saw in the Kingswood apartment development. That's a slightly different set of requirements for trees, but they ended up, I think, replanting 90-something, and they were only required to do 30-something trees, if I'm remembering correctly. And a lot of that was triggered on these landscape regulations that are a requirement of the development overall.
So 2 things. At the end of the day, we're still losing established semi-mature or mature trees and tree canopy, even though we might be planting more new trees. At the end of the day, we're losing tree canopy for several years until these new trees potentially build. And you might have the data later, but, so what percentage of the applicants each year are waived because they don't meet the greater of the 12 trees per acre or the 20%?
Yeah, the majority of our developments do file under that criteria. So the majority of the large developments within the city do, go under their required tree retention on site. So they go through the waiver process.
Are you meeting 51% or are you meeting 90%?
I'd have to look back, but the majority of subdivisions, apartment buildings, et cetera, they would, just because of the stormwater requirements and other infrastructure improvements, to maximize the density on a piece of property, that is, what is typical.
So at the end of the day, my big concern is we're losing, semi-mature or mature established trees and tree canopy. In order to meet, I understand there's other requirements that have to be met. So it's just interesting to me that we have this requirement for tree protection, but we're not, it's hardly ever achieving it. So I don't know what the answer is, but I see a big disconnect. And I think when we review the tree code, I don't know if our consultants are gonna try to tackle this
Are they
dilemma.
doing that too? Tree code, are they tackling the tree
So we
code?
have, two different consultants for the three different sections of code. The street tree and this section, are one consultant, and they're looking at both of those, and then the landscape code is a different consultant.
Okay.
But they are looking at how they interact with one another.
You just scroll back to the start of that.
You think 90% of them get a waiver?
Probably 100.
Well, I know it's not 100, but it is, the majority of them, at least, 80 or 90.
Very beginning, when it said 12 trees per acre, it says
Yeah.
12 trees per acre or 20% of the trees on the property shall be retained. Okay, we've counted trees in the wetlands and the wetland buffers and around the edges or whatever to try to get to that figure. And you can't do it unless you're able to retain trees and count them in the wetland and wetland buffer.
Some of those trees you're saying, you're saying some of the trees in the wetlands are cottonwoods, poplars, and willows.
And ash, and cedar, and whatever. And also, we've been able to show that some of the habitat trees that are real important to have count. So it's good we're having this discussion because
That's a dilemma. We have this goal, but we're never meeting it.
yeah,
And so something's wrong.
and that's,
Either it's
Yeah, and
totally unrealistic goal and we're just kidding ourselves every time we get an application, or we need to change the priority within the city to meet these climate goals that trees are a big part of in achieving, that, maybe, we can't have as many units, or maybe we need to go even higher with our development so that we have more open space to retain more of these established trees. I mean, I don't have the answer, but the people that do this for a living probably can provide options for how can we meet the housing requirements and also these requirements, because we're really kidding ourselves that we're meeting these codes, because we're not.
well, the thing we've tried to do ever since the tree board started was to get the developers to look at the property in relation to the code before they had their development figured out on paper.
It sounds like they're supposed to do that. They're supposed to,
Well,
before anything happens, they're supposed to go through this
I
process.
mean, that is what we talk with them about through the development review.
It all comes in, but then they're given a waiver and away they go.
A waiver in this circumstance is a part of the development code process. So it is not a variance from the code, which requires a hearing examiner, process and public hearing. This is an administrative process that if they meet certain criteria, it's a part of the ordinance. They are allowed to go through it.
Code's being met, they're just doing it with these, if you don't meet this, then you gotta go do this, do this, but still we're not meeting the intent of the code, which is 20% of the trees or 12 trees.
It's like a compromise of the climate mitigation options. One of the as I look at, for example, Yorkshire, and this is an attempt to go higher rather than wider,
Yeah, yeah.
but what struck me is that when we go higher, we still need the parking lots,
Right.
because you're just stacking people up, but we don't have a way to stack cars up, it seems. maybe.
Well, it's called parking garages, which are very
Yeah.
expensive.
So we're increasing the hardscape around these higher buildings for the sake of,
Although I think on a lot of, probably wrong, I know Olympia, and like, you don't have to provide parking for high-rise buildings.
Which is controversial in its own right.
right.
And so there are different, oh, sorry, Alyssa, go ahead.
If we didn't have density, then we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't have adequate transportation systems if we didn't have enough density. So prioritizing transportation like intercity transit in areas that are higher density, that should be the number one priority in active.
Communities.
Walkable, bikeable, rollable, and transit being number one, personal vehicles being the lowest of that, and giving less space to the personal vehicles.
We've suggested that perhaps where we have these parking lots, we need, in order to deal with canopy and heat sinks or heat hotspots,
Islands?
we need to increase the, trees in the parking lots so as to mitigate those heat. And I don't know that there's anything like that in the code that says, if you increase the parking lot, you need to increase the medians or something like that for
Something,
canopy.
Isn't there a number of
trees.
trees per parking space? Or
we
number
can
of
put that in
parking
the landscaping code as a requirement.
Yeah.
So every 10 spaces, for a development of these sizes that we're talking about, because there is a lower threshold where you don't have to have landscape islands on either side of a 10-tree parking bay. But for these types of developments that are large, you would have 10 spaces or 100 feet maximum between landscape islands on either side, and you'd have a tree in each of those landscape islands. And the issue is that at the young age of these trees, when you have a new development, you've got less canopy coverage, you've got younger trees.
They're likely to not mature to the same size as what was removed.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the root volume or the soil volume to support a larger growing tree.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe there's a discussion about, keeping the landscape islands within that same spacing, but providing larger landscape islands, so there's the possibility of, trees to grow taller or grow larger within these areas to provide better canopy. Just trying to think of strategies, because I know in a time when we don't have the intercity transit or the frequency of the walkable city and the, commercial mixed-use type of interactions, we need to find spaces for people to live, and that's a real challenge. So that push and pull of competing values is in my brain every day, and we are dealing with it on paper here as we're talking about it.
So what would be your philosophy, or what strategies might work to meet all these competing requirements?
Well, if I had a perfect answer, I would be the consultant for the tree and landscaping. No, and we've got great ideas put into the draft ordinance. We've got, discussions happening about our code changes and how we're thinking about housing in general right now as we're updating our comprehensive plan. So right now is a real time of influx as far as how our development code is going to look, 20 years down the road, and how developments are going to be put in the ground 20 years from now. And I think that is one of the issues with this exact tree code, is that it's been quite a while since we updated it. Don't know the exact date or year, but it is more than likely from a time when development was very different in Tumwater,
Right.
just in general.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily meant to handle the issues that we're seeing now from a climate change perspective, or from a larger, population rise and the amount of apartments that we need. So there are lots of new issues that we're trying to deal with, and it's evolving as we're working on it.
I know this is controversial, but the actual size of the parking spaces, I know we reduced them on campus. I worked at the Capitol campus, where we reduced the size of the parking space. It was in a garage, so it didn't gain us any more places to plant trees, but in a non-garage setting, it could create more real estate for trees, but then people with their giant vehicles are not gonna be happy.
Yeah.
But I'm just very interested in creative thinking in how to meet all these objectives,
Yeah.
Beyond the tree pieces and the
Yeah.
canopy. They all have, they all need value, attention.
They interact, in every aspect of the code, so, absolutely. All right, well, I can continue moving forward.
It's revealing to know that we're not achieving this over 90% of the time. I was suspicious just looking around,
Yeah.
but until you actually get the data or hear from the people that are making the decisions.
I mean, it is a important development tool to be able to achieve the densities that we have or the, need for, growth within our community. So that's why we're, seeing it. I mean, it's great that we've got, the interest in this area. That's, an important part of it. But it's also got its downsides as well. There's no question.
Thanks for helping with the language, because I was, exemption, variance,
Yeah.
waiver.
Yep.
And they all are used in this code, and they all have very specific meanings and applications. So this is helping me sort that out, in my mind at least, a little bit better. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Maybe they should come with definitions.
Yeah,
The code should come with definitions of what all these words are.
and I just have to voice my experience that the people that are moving into my neighborhood, which is quarter acre, third acre lots, are commuting to Seattle. They're moving to Tumwater because they can't find affordable, nice housing in Seattle. So at some point, Tumwater can say, what kind of community do we want to be? And say, we're not going to build housing like this. If you want to live in housing like that, go someplace else. Because that's what's happening in my neighborhood.
It's very hard to do with the state standards.
Yeah.
We really don't have many options when it comes to, middle housing. It's a mandate now from the state, so there's no,
Define middle housing.
middle housing is, duplex, triplex, quadplex, and then even fiveplexes.
ADUs,
Um,
that kind of.
ADUs also are, parts of middle housing as well. Apartments, townhomes can be middle housing.
Anything to make it more dense, it sounds like.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's trying to fill in, the single-family housing that we have and, utilize it where it makes sense for these other, structure types. And a lot of times, it's gonna look like a single-family home from the outside, but it's gonna have, 4 condos on the inside, or it's going to have, 3 apartments inside of it. But. Is that all, yeah? Yeah, so any, planning, city or county within, Washington State.
Rochester, Tenino, it just hasn't hit there yet?
Well, they're planning for it now. So right now, our comprehensive plan is required to be updated by the end of 2025. So everyone that's a planning city or county is required to do this planning, and all of the counties allocate a certain amount of housing to different cities or counties to plan for. So like Thurston County overall has a certain amount of units that they are allocated from the state that are to be, that they're planning on housing needs here. So then they divide that out amongst all the cities and counties. And each of those cities and counties have to then plan for how we're going to meet those higher density or higher housing requirements within the city that we have.
I assume some cities, let's say like Olympia, where it's already built, they don't have as many options as Tumwater has.
Right, and they have, I think they were on the forefront of implementing middle housing to begin with, which was to put in their code where single-family homes are allowed, these other structure types are also allowed. And they have their own development requirements, that are per unit and et cetera, depending on where they are within the city itself. But they were the ones kind of pushing that forward from a individual city perspective. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago.
Missing middle thing.
Yep. yeah, there's a lawsuit about it that went to the Supreme Court, I think, and, yeah, state Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this could all change with the new government.
So the state I mean, these requirements are in play right now as, need to be planned for by cities. I'm not sure, I wouldn't want to speculate as far as how that could change with new legislature coming in.
Or the legislature.
So moving, forward to, so this talks about additional standards as it relates to, trees. We already talked about where the standard is waived or modified. The applicant shall plant no less than 3 trees, for each tree cleared in excess of the standard. So as you mentioned, the standard is the 12 trees or 20%. The modification or waiver is that going below the 12 trees or 20% by meeting 3 of those 5 criteria, and then replanting at a rate of 3 to 1 for each tree cleared below the 12 trees or 20%.
Letter D answered one of my questions about if you do have to replant, does it have to be a native or not? Here it says it can be either, but it's still intriguing to me, like if we cut down a native shore pine, that we don't have to replace it with a native pine.
We do, encourage native replanting.
Look at that. It makes more sense to have something different, a different code. And again, I'm not.
Depends too, you might be taking down trees, but that might be like extra parking.
Fry.
Appreciate.
Yeah, right, the new habitat.
Yeah.
But we've seen in the inventory that Norway maple and pears are taking over the water. That's dangerous.
Or maybe it would be limited to the tree protection
Sidewalk,
tract
too.
where a native plant's more likely to thrive. I guess that was my original question. If we put in new trees into a tree protection tract, it might make more sense for those to be native. Whereas I think one of our case studies, they were putting a non-native pine into the tract. So is the consultant already looking at these codes, or that's gonna happen in the?
We're still on pause, until we have that, position at the city that would manage that consultant hired.
Urban forest?
No, but the urban forester will be involved heavily.
We have a list of things we want the consultants to look at?
We have a draft ordinance, that's based on the,
I mean, these.
Community conversations.
Are being listed somewhere?
yes, through the community engagement that we did last year and through the minutes of the tree board, those are being captured.
So C kind of talks about what we were, talking about as far as development, where replanting is prioritized with the tree tract, and open space. And that, minimum of 5% of the buildable area, shall be set aside when you're not meeting that, standard. So when you modify or get a waiver, you have to do the, 5% open space, 5% tree tract. If you,
New trees in a tree tract have to be native.
yes, yep,
That answers that question.
yeah, that's great.
Well, those-
Coniferous or deciduous trees.
In that one case study, we're going into the tree tract, though.
We can look at that. I mean, if one of them has not been, developed yet, then we can let them know to swap that out.
No, I'm not saying it wasn't in the
Okay.
tree tract, but for some reason I got that impression in my mind. It may not be accurate.
Okay. Yeah, so if you are meeting the standard, you do not have to do that 5% tree tract. That is, it's only when you get when you do the modified or a waiver, then you do the 5% tree tract, of the developed property. What was that?
Which is 90% of the time.
Sure. And then so then we get into the, discussion about if you cannot meet the the replanting within the development, then, being able to use the city,
Refund.
tree fund, as an option to provide a cash payment. And was that $400 a tree when it was most recently calculated, or it was?
I know
Yeah.
that we were working on expanding what the funding could be used for, including restoration and other efforts, because right now,
It's really low now. I don't know if that's been adjusted for inflation or
Probably
actually
not.
real cost for buying and installing and maintaining a tree.
for the true ecological benefit of the trees.
But there's other things for consultants, I think, to reevaluate.
I remember sending them some ecosystem services information on this is how much, like in terms of carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services, what's the value of a tree?
Chris, has the city, as the regulator, denied, permit request, because it hasn't met requirements?
They've all met the requirements in, one option or another.
Have you ever had a situation where you say, you know, if you build 10 less apartments, and put that into open space, then that will mitigate some of the stuff here. Does the city have that power?
No, the, development regulations are the parameters, set. And I don't have any authority to say to a developer, reduce density or increase density. If their proposal is in line with the ordinance requirements, then, we have to move forward with that, as a matter of law.
And you said that, of course, the laws were written before we were building 1,150 apartments at once.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I mean, if it was, yes, absolutely. So this is,
That's an important one there, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the instance with the Kingswood apartment, proposal. In situations where a parcel of land to be developed does not meet the retention standard, in an undeveloped state, so, if you have an acre parcel, the requirement is, 12 trees per acre, 20% of the trees. If they only have 8 trees on that property to begin with, you are under the required amount, just in an undeveloped state. So the requirement is that you bring that development up to 1-to-1 with what the requirement would be, so 12 trees in this circumstance. However, in a development setting like Kingswood Apartments, you've got a lot more requirements for tree plantings as a part of the landscaping. So you do end up getting a lot more trees in that situation than it was in an undeveloped state to begin with.
So if you're starting with a bare lot, we might come out ahead.
That lot was not developed on before, so it pretty much was a bare lot.
Yeah, that weren't
Yeah,
necessarily
it's-
desirable, right?
Yes, correct. Yep, and,
Field is Scottsboro.
Right.
yeah,
Is Kingswood, is that the apartment over by
A 5-story.
by the
church.
Tyee.
Kingswood is there by
Home Depot?
Home Depot. On Tyee Drive.
Between Toyota and Home Depot.
The one over here is Yorkshire.
There's Yorkshire and Belmont Flats. So I think that, includes the development regulation component. And then we can get into some of this, case study, just run through it pretty quick. We've got 15 minutes, but, yeah, so Belmont Flats is at the, roundabout at, the end of Tyee Drive. There's a stub out, going south. So Tyee will be extended, and on the west side of Tyee will be the Yorkshire development, and on the east side of Tyee will be the Belmont Flats development.
Same developer.
2 different developers.
Joining properties.
We've kind of walked through the reason why and, the different retention requirements. So in this circumstance, the 12 trees per acre was for the higher amount, so that was the amount that was required to be retained. The proposed tree retention was 32 trees, so they had a shortfall of 137 trees, and 411 trees are required to be replanted as a part of the proposed development, and they have that 5% tree tract.
Is that where the 32 trees are, is in that 5%, or?
Yeah, the vast majority of the 32 are already in the tree tract. Yep, that's correct. Yep.
So 411 trees. And initially I thought, okay, the tree tract is how many acres?
So it'd be 5% of the,
Buildable.
or, yeah, of the, yeah, of the 15, so that'd be like,
14 acres, 5% of that is half an acre. 5%.
0.75,
Tenth of an acre.
0.75 of an acre, I think, yes.
411 trees on 0.75 acres.
No, that's not what, yeah.
Deal with that?
Yeah, so the priority for replanting is within that 5% tree tract. So if there's space and where the spacing makes sense, that is the priority for where you replant the trees. And then the remaining gets distributed amongst the rest of the site through landscape code requirements, meeting parking requirements, and then, yes, they do.
And the tree tract then would be planted at 16 by 16 or something like that?
The forester arborist creates a plan for how to replant it and make sure that the spacing is appropriate for the species.
Mixed species.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it is, and other times it is not.
They should all be native.
Correct, based on that.
So maybe 50 trees are gonna be planted on that, 7/10 of an acre. That means 350 trees are gonna be planted. They're gonna find places.
Throughout the development,
Parking lot with 300 more trees.
around the development, around like the open space areas, they've got other, like required active and passive open space areas as a part of the development. So I think there's a, you know, dog, run, there's like a small playground as a part of it. So, yeah, they usually.
You shared a landscape plan for that development, right? Where all the trees are gonna go?
I think that was Kingswood Apartments, the shared, yep. Yeah, because this one isn't at the development stage yet. They're, approved, but they have not started construction. Maybe a year ago or 7 months ago, something like that.
How can we get the biggest 411 trees, biggest maturing that the soil volume
And,
sustain in a thriving condition?
I mean, what percentage of those are gonna be native?
Probably very few in a
Yeah.
parking lot.
That can survive in that, all of the planting sites.
They're not gonna be Doug fir cedars or big leaf maples.
So the environment for the native animals, birds, critters, can change. I mean, of course, it's gonna be hardscape, but even the plants that they rely on to eat, nest in, aren't gonna be there.
There's going to definitely be a change to the landscape in, the developed areas, absolutely. So then moving to, the next one, we've got the Yorkshire Tree Report. So, yep, that's on the west side of Tyee, as it extends down. Yes, 1,150 apartments, 9,000 squetas. Yep. So there was one question about the impervious surface of that, proposed development. So, it's proposed at 73% of the property. The maximum impervious surface is 85% within the general commercial zone district, and it's, 53 dwelling units per acre.
And that impervious surface draining into, the tree medians and the storm sewer.
Yeah, so various different, methods. I mean, they, I don't remember if the, drainage report for this one called for underground facilities or if there were, like bioretention facilities or ponds or anything along those, but I bet it would be a mix of those, different facilities.
How much did these parcels or plats sell for, do you know?
I have no idea. The sale price is on the assessor's website, for, the land, it should be.
I think it's difficult. Sometimes they put together other properties with the one, so they sort of shield what they really pay for the one.
The prioritization would be in the tree tract, and, similarly with this one, the 12 trees per acre was the higher amount, and the required, replanting is 645 trees, throughout the property.
Maybe a question for Alyssa. 21 acres, the animals that have been living on this 21 acres obviously are not going to be able to live there any longer. Is there any study that says where are they going to go?
Not that I'm aware of not for the city that I know of.
We have bears in town.
But, what about wildlife corridors and stuff? They're right now possible for an animal, on the west side of I-5. I-5 is a barrier. But to go from undeveloped property there over to cross Little Rock Road, and there's a wildlife area. The wildlife area's it goes through, Meerset, and then gets interrupted at, Countryside. And there's no wildlife area in the countryside now. And then it's open, to the Capitol Forest. We're just breaking up these wildlife corridors to make it impossible for animals to migrate from across our city or across this land, their land.
You're wondering, Jim, if these tree tracks were different plots could be adjoining or connecting somehow?
Well, that was,
Instead of having 5%.
I'm curious about how the city,
If they
if
could
you
be
look
connected.
at
That's something that we were
the
working on in the
neighboring
draft code.
properties to see
to have
where those
connectivity.
trees should be retained so as to create these
Yeah,
wildlife
yeah.
corridors.
Certain instances, it can definitely make sense. In others, either new infrastructure will break it up, like Tye Road is gonna break up this larger undeveloped area into two different halves, and both are going to end up being developed. So you couldn't really combine a tree tract between those two that would allow for, that you could maybe put them closer together, but where are the mature trees that are best developed? How do we balance these different components of, where the best trees are and saving those trees on the property as opposed to, thinking about what the, interconnectivity is? I would agree that, where there is an opportunity, definitely in, wetland buffers and, connected areas where we, can't do development, we're going to have the connectivity there. But where can we create that connectivity, through our development regulations? That's a great question.
Right, yeah, that's where we need to
People working.
revise the new regulations so as to see that these corridors are left. I mean,
Yeah.
20 years ago, nobody
Yeah, that
worried
was-
about that.
We've talked about that.
In the code, and also I just want to note that a lot of, I'm not saying this as an excuse, but a lot of wildlife has adapted to live in urban conditions and more urban conditions. Like, we have more deer here than there were in years prior, is my understanding from, people who have been here for a long time, because in some ways it is safer for them here. They're not going to be predated or hunted. And they have found it to, they might be run over by cars. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to have no animals die ever, and I don't want us to have a loss of habitat. But, other species, insects aside, do have a way of adapting and still being able to survive and do well in environments that are different. Insects have their own very specific species that they depend on, in a much more narrow sense. So I almost want to focus in terms of habitat connectivity, making sure that those species are available, and having the more adaptive, animals still being provided for and thought about. But the things that, the smaller species that have less ability to adapt, being a high priority for us to consider first and foremost too, and they're bottom of the food chain more so, and
The basis of the
yeah.
food chain, yeah.
so that's why native plants are so important. And birds can nest in any number of different kinds of trees. They can find nesting habitat. But
Unless you're
butterflies,
probably
whatever they're eating, if they don't have the plants that they need to be able to reproduce, then that's a concern. There's all different levels of what to look at in terms of habitat and providing the resources for the other residents of the city, the non-human residents.
This costs money, but I keep thinking about Central Park and how genius that was to have the roads go under other roads, or in this case, they could go under animal corridors. So there's, again, creative ways to solve the dilemma, but
And
it increases the cost of development.
I would love to invite, if the tree board wants, Department of Transportation has some staff that work specifically on habitat corridors and wildlife crossings, that they're doing fantastic work, and I think it would be really interesting for you all to hear about what they're doing.
Yeah.
If you'd be open for me inviting them for a presentation, one of these meetings.
So we've already talked about these different components from the section of code that has the modification or waiver. I just added in kind of our conversation already in written format as to why some of these modifications, make sense from a planning perspective, and where our development regulations, are somewhat the driving force in trying to enable the highest densities possible, why that's being promoted within, cities, as opposed to in counties. And then, in the last instance where we're talking about reconfiguring or lessening, the amount of parking, the Belmont project, has, first floor parking on a couple of the buildings. So they, did try and reduce, some of the surface parking, and their surface parking was very close to the minimum parking spaces that we would allow within a development, within our current development regulations. So there were 833 parking spaces required, and they put 839 as a part of the development. You can only go 10% above or below as an administrative, decision. And then once you start increasing past 10%, you have to start meeting other requirements for increasing your parking and justifying it.
Certain percentage that could be required for compact. They're again reducing a certain number of the parking spaces.
So a lot of times they take advantage of that allowance. I think there is a percentage that is allowed out of the total. I don't have that off the top of my head, but that you can reduce a certain amount of your parking. Yeah, mostly compact parking. And that is what the C represented on the plan.
What about, this isn't really related to space, but are they required to put in a certain percentage of EV chargers now?
Yes, that's state code requirements, yeah.
Well, I might want to move in there.
Perfect.
I park under a tree.
There you go.
If you can find a tree.
Only one.
We're gonna paint trees on the building, like the
tower, water tower.
Those don't count.
This is the Kingswood Apartments development. Just as we mentioned, it just didn't have
That's the winner.
tree
We're
retention.
getting 90 trees.
Yeah.
And then this just kind of reiterates,
Couldn't have room for grass there, where are they gonna put trees?
In the parking lot.
I hope so. I pity the trees, so.
and this reiterates what we were talking about earlier about, the 1-for-1 ratio, and
Yeah.
just reemphasizes that code requirement. So I know we're at 9 o'clock. I'd be happy to send this PowerPoint out and just give you, these are my responses to all of your great questions. Happy to send this out to you all and make it available, as you would like. I'm not sure if you want to go through all of these right now, if you have the time, happy to spend some extra time here. It's up to you.
Like 3 slides of
Yeah,
helps people make decisions.
3 lines of what?
3 slides of responses to questions. And a lot of it we've already gone over.
Many of them.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about what I submitted.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know what else other people submitted.
So, yeah, we've talked about the 5% tree tract, I think, in totality, and then the code variances are only as it relates to Hearing examiner is the one that deals with variances to the code. Modifications or waivers are built into the code as administrative allowances if they meet certain criteria. So land clearing exemptions have applied for in the last few years. So in 2021, 16, 2022, 17, 23, 28, and then in 2024 so far we've had 25. So that just gives you some of the numbers there. It doesn't talk about the amount of trees, but that's just the applications applied for to this point.
Do you have any idea what percent of the development, what percent of the developments require variance?
So most developments do not require variances.
So this is an unusual exception
These are,
to get a variance.
Yeah, so typically, the modification or waiver that's built into the code, that would not be considered a variance, since that is an administrative allowance as a part of the code. A variance would be a different request that is outside of what the code would allow, just in and of itself, and can only be approved by a hearing examiner. It would not be an administrative decision. So, for example, if someone wanted to build a home on a steep slope piece of property and they couldn't meet certain setbacks, they would go to the hearing examiner and request a variance to reduce the setbacks so they could move it away from where the steep slopes were and, impact that less, but then we were giving a little bit on a setback, potentially. So maybe the front setback gets reduced from 10 to 5, which we cannot do by administrative allowance, but the hearing examiner could do that as long as they meet certain criteria. So some advice, we're very excited about the potential for new forester and, having an expert in-house for some of the questions and, development review. That'll be really awesome to be able to pick their brain and just get more involved there. So the removing the ability to use like storm facilities for active open space is one component that, I think, having more open space where you can plant trees and, set aside, area for play area, that would be amazing in my mind, creating maybe more pocket parks and having, less areas that are just wide open areas that are these dual purpose, which is great, but at the same time, you want the individuals living in these areas to also have access to more parks and, available play space that is more welcoming than only being available half of the year potentially. So those are a couple of mine. See on the map is the compact car spots. So in the last 3 years, we have not found a contractor for removing more trees than allowed. I believe a previous planner, Suresh, did have an instance where there were fines, but I can't really find much documentation of that or where that went necessarily. So that was more in talking with the permit manager and her interactions with Suresh while they were overlapping in time.
I'm the person in my neighborhood, $100 a day.
$100 a day, for how many days?
For a long time, because they didn't replace it. I thought it was funny.
And then do we allow contractors to remove mature western cedar and suggest they plant western cedar back? So we have the arborist recommend the trees, native trees to be replanted, but we don't have that requirement unless it's within the tree tract. So that's where we can require native trees to be replanted, but we don't have the ability in other areas of development.
So we can require it in the future, you're saying?
Yeah.
Marking it.
In the ordinance, yep. So a couple of these are questions about different development standards for different areas around the city. So the county did have a lot of development in certain areas kind of on the outskirts. So while they did apply Tumwater standards. Sometimes they were a couple years lagging in what Tumwater actually had in our ordinance, since we only update the county plan with the city so often. So that's why some developments just look different. Some were even approved a longer time ago. They built the infrastructure, never had the homes, constructed, and now we're just seeing those homes come online, like on Elm Street or Henderson Boulevard. There are a couple of plats right in those areas that were approved in early 2000s. The recession hit and, just stopped development in those areas, and then boom, they came right back up once.
Really to those old standards.
Yeah, so they are building to those old standards in a lot of ways. They have to meet current building code requirements, though. So they are required from that perspective to meet the energy code requirements and our current building code standards. And then for state properties, a lot of the state developments do go above and beyond with their open space standards. So they've got a lot more of a plan for their connectivity and their trail network around. Those are not requirements from the city. Those are just the state implementing some practices for the staff that work there. And the trail is an awesome resource. I love it working at City Hall and being able to walk over there. Yeah, but it is not necessarily a standard that we have in our ordinance. It would be great to add something, like around larger storm ponds, for example, having like a little walking trail around those. But then you need certain fencing requirements to deter people from going in there. So yeah, just a little balancing act between where we can require certain things and what we would like to do with our recreation space. And then the last question was about, I felt like it was more about some of the middle housing requirements and not necessarily any federal requirements for providing housing. To me, the state requirements are kind of what we're working towards as a city right now, because that's kind of our required planning toolbox that we have to work from. And then I've got my contact information here and just the link to the ordinance right there for you all to peruse at your leisure. Fun reading. But hopefully we've gone through kind of the big fundamentals and talked through how development standards are being implemented. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. I know I've talked to many of you individually and on one-offs, but this hopefully provides just some broader overall context to how we have to approve development within the city under this code right now, and then what we can look forward to as a part of our development code changes in the future.
The goal to have the code be updated, to have our date in your mind?
That's a really difficult issue because we've got our comprehensive plan that's our primary priority right now. We've got the state mandate to have not only the comprehensive plan updated, but also the ordinances updated by the end of 2025. And maybe that got extended 6 months or something like that, but end of December. Okay, so it is end of December 2025. So a lot of our resources just have to be shifted in that direction right now, which is why we have to wait for the additional staff to come on until we restart that process. Yeah.
Have more people living here, they pay more taxes, and we can hire more staff.
We've been advertising the position. We've advertised the position 3 times now. People have accepted it 3 times now and not decided to follow through. So we're having a hard time filling the position. It's not that we're not trying. It's, we're sincerely trying.
It's
No, that one's not posted yet. That one's not posted yet.
it's a planner position for our long-range planning group.
That would be the person that would be managing the contractors to lead this, the urban forester. We're gonna advertise the position if it gets passed in the budget. The other 50%, that's another thing that has to get passed. We'll advertise that position very early on in 2025 with the intent to have them by the end of spring. And they would also be heavily involved in those code revision processes.
Well, it's nice to meet a person that's doing this work, and thanks for helping demystify something that's not always easy to track or understand, especially just starting with definitions can be very confusing.
I would like to say, I just hope you don't have any sense that we're adversarial. I want to be your biggest fan.
Yeah, no.
If you want something done, you're the one that has to deal with it. And you're the person on the road, and you're the one that can really tell us where the problems are.
Yeah,
And so I hope we can really, we've benefited a lot from you being here tonight. I have. And contacting you by email and getting information from you in the past. So I really appreciate your work, and I want to support you 100% in what you want to see change. I hope we can help you do that.
yeah, and, you know, the city is, through our public engagement process and then also through listening to the, tree board, you know, meetings and being involved with Alyssa through all of the comprehensive plan process, the feedback is being translated to, the experts. So that's first off, and then, you know, we are working on, those other updates and continuing to track, you know, what additional we can do to implement, you know, the best practices. So I definitely appreciate all of your expertise and, yeah, like I said, only been here 3 years and already learned a ton, and very happy to have a supportive and very engaged community. That's amazing.
Good. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay. So our next meeting date, 9/9, are we doing,
Field trip.
field trip?
Yes, so if you could all, please, the meeting will start, the field trip will be at 6. We'll meet here at City Hall at 6 so that we make sure we have enough sunlight. I'll stop sharing the screen. We will be going to, the Sap Road Park and the future operations and maintenance facility and park. I'm working on getting tour guides for both locations of the experts that are working specifically on those projects. We'll have a city van, so please do come at 6, for us to depart from here. We'll go to the O&M facility first, and then Sap Road Park. Last year, we didn't have a quorum, so if you won't be here and we won't have a quorum, please let me know so that we're not waiting around for 20, 30 minutes for people to show up. You won't be here, okay. Well, now I know 2 people won't be here, and we'll miss you.
I'll be here.
Oh, you'll be here, okay. So we'll only be missing 1 so far, but, I'll put you all in a van, and we'll do the field trip and have conversation, and I will try furiously to take really good meeting minutes by hand. So 1 at a time speaking, please. But that's the next meeting, indeed.
Great. Great. All right, well, I'm gonna make a motion to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? None? Me neither.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can start work later tomorrow morning.
Not tomorrow, but, so it'll offset.